We're here at the Miami Book Fair, South Florida Poetry Journal. I'm Sally Naylor, Associate Editor. I want to thank Michael Amara for his technical assistance, and we're also happy to have Lenny Della Rocca, the editor, here. Okay, so Barbara, I'm wondering if you could start us off by reading a selection from your new work, Bird Odyssey.
Okay. Um, do you want me to talk a little bit about the book?
Absolutely.
It's kind of a project book. In 2010 I got a Guggenheim Fellowship, and I knew I'd always wanted to go to Russia because I love Russian writers, poets, and novelists. Dostoevsky is one of my favorites. I love Tolstoy. Chekhov taught me everything about the short story. I also write fiction, so I really studied Chekhov. I read all of his stories one summer, trying to figure out how he wrote his short stories. And so these are writers who are part of my literary DNA. And I also love trains. I love to travel on trains. And so the longest train in the world is the Trans-Siberian Railroad. So I've been trying to talk my husband into taking this trip for years, and he was just unconvinced. But I had the money in my hot little hands. And I said, I'm going to take the Trans-Siberian Railroad. And he said, I'll go with you. I'll go with you. And I go, great. So we flew into St. Petersburg, and I set up little tours to all of my different literary idols. We went to Tolstoy's house at Yasnaya Polanya. We went on a Dostoevsky walking tour of St. Petersburg, visited Pushkin's house. It was just a dream come true. One of my favorite novels is The Master and Margarita. In Moscow, I set up a whole day Master and Margarita walking tour of Moscow. It was a bookish girl's dream come true. So when I was on this trip, I started writing these poems. I had no idea that what would come of it, but then it was just the poems just started jumping out at me and wrestling me down in the streets. So I started writing there, and then in the next year I wrote more poems. And then I thought, oh, I really would love to take that Jack Kerouac, across the country trip. And my husband said, forget it. I'm not going to drive. And I hate to drive. I like to take trains, but I hate to drive. And so he said, let's go from Memphis to New Orleans on the Blues Highway. So we did that. And then same thing happened. The poems just started, they just came. I wrote almost half of that section while we were on the trip. And then my university has this summer stipend for a project. And so I said, let me follow the Odyssey from Troy to Ithaca, and they gave me the money to do that. So this book is a record of those 3 trips, kind of, and I prepared myself in different ways. But one of the things that I loved about this project is that there was a kind of miscegenation between the trips. So the first poem I think I'd like to read is one in which the Russian trip jumped into the Memphis to New Orleans trip. And it's when we were in Graceland waiting to go across the street, I started thinking about all of the similarities between Tolstoy and Elvis, because the summer before we'd gone to Yasnaya Polanya, and there were tour buses disgorging people. Everyone was excited. We took a tour through the house, and it was really really exciting. And the same thing was going on with Elvis. But then I'd read about both of the writers. Well, Elvis wasn't a writer; he was a singer. But Tolstoy, and they had a lot of similarities in their personal lives too. So this is the poem that came out of it. Also, too, I was born in New Orleans, and I really wanted to write about Katrina. And this was a way that I got into it. I didn't know that was going to happen until the end of the poem. This is called Elvis and Tolstoy Saved the World. I'm standing in line waiting for the bus to take me across the street to Graceland when Tolstoy shows up with his white beard and peasant's garb, and I smell him before I see him because, let's face it, Menin's speed stick was not big at Yasnaya Polanya, but I recognize him right away, those big ears and the beard like one of the guys in ZZ Top, and I say, Lev Nikolaevich, what are you doing here? And he gives me this mix of stink eye and what are you doing later? And says, I need to talk to Elvis. And I'm thinking, Tolstoy looked at my boobs. And what's Tolstoy want to say to Elvis at the same moment? And if one more supernatural thing happens, my brain might explode. Will we just get on the bus, sit down, and put on our headphones? But I can't stop thinking about how much Elvis and Tolstoy have in common, as in hundreds of people standing in line to tour their houses. And Tolstoy had a favorite daughter, Alexandra, and he had Chernov and all his celibate followers. And Elvis had Lisa Marie and the Memphis Mafia. And there were Priscilla and Sonia, both driven mad by the great one's sexual inhibitions. So when we arrive at Graceland, which, contrary to my expectations, is not cheesy, but a middle-class family home. And the guides tell us to go through the house at our own pace, but not to go upstairs, though that doesn't stop Tolstoy, who heads right up, and since no one says anything to him, I follow along in his wake. And he goes to Elvis's bedroom without knocking or anything, and there's Elvis lying on the bed, but the young Elvis with his sad eyes. And Tolstoy says, Elvis, quit moping around. We have work to do. And I'm standing over by the closet trying to visualize an Elvis Tolstoy project. But Elvis tells Tolstoy that he can't help him. I'm sad, he says. My mama's dead, and she's the only one who really loved me. My mother just died too, I say. And Elvis's head jerks up. Who's she? He asks Tolstoy, who shakes his head. I don't know, some groupie. Forget her. We have to save the world. What's wrong with it? Says Elvis. What's wrong with it? Tolstoy's head explodes and then comes right back together again like some crazy cat cartoon, which gets Elvis's attention. How long since you've been outside? Says Tolstoy. I've been dead, says Elvis, but Tolstoy pulls him off the bed. That's no excuse. And I think groupie? Black Sabbath has groupies, but Tolstoy? If I were going to be a groupie, I'd be following Chekhov around because he's my idea of a guy I'd like to spend time with. But I'm here with Tolstoy and Elvis, and both are as crazy as rats in a coffee can. But for dead guys, they're moving fast. And I make a note to amp up my morning walk because I'm huffing as Tolstoy shoves Elvis into the pink Cadillac, and I barely make it into the back seat because Lev Nikolaevich is gunning the engine, heading south on Highway 61 to Natchez and New Orleans because, as everyone knows, that's where the world almost ended on August 29th, 2005, when Katrina hit the Gulf Coast like an apocalyptic medieval shitstorm. And when I look at my watch, the hands are moving backwards fast. The Cadillac speedometer is moving past 80, 100, and we take off into the clouds, which are gray as a Confederate uniform, then black. And Tolstoy says, we have to blast Katrina with our combined mojo, Elvis, or New Orleans will be sucked into the center of the earth. And Elvis says, Jesus Christ. And Tolstoy says, no, man. It's just you and me. And Elvis jerks his head backwards and says, who's she again? And Tolstoy shakes his head and looks into the rearview mirror. She's going to write the poem.
Thank you so much.
You're very welcome.
My confession is that I was going to ask you to read that poem, but I said, no, back off and let the poet decide what she wants to read.
I love to read that poem. I just love it. It's one of those. Just other aspiring poets out there. It was turned down so many times, and one time by a magazine that published me a lot, many times before, and they said, we like the beginning, but the ending just doesn't work at all. If you want to rewrite it and send it back to us, we'd be happy to look at it. And I just thought, I knocked it out of the ballpark there, but I guess, it's just one of those things. You have to find an editor who's sympathetic with you. And finally, the editors of Epic, the literary magazine at Cornell, took it, and they got the response I was hoping. They said, we love the ending of the poem. So, you just have to, don't be discouraged if somebody turns it down 1, 2, 3, 4 times. You have to keep looking for the right reader.
You know, one question that has always intrigued me about you, one thing I've always wanted to ask you was who gave you permission to have so much fun with literature and poetry? It's not like you had Billy Collins to read when you were, 15.
Well, I was a really a serious poet. My father loved poetry. He wasn't an educated man, but he just loved poetry. He loved to memorize it. And my bedtime stories were his. He liked Robert Service, the Tales of the Yukon, and so he would recite those poems as bedtime stories when I was a little girl. So I think that gave me permission to think that poetry was something real in the world. It was, and then when I was in the um, third grade, I had my first story published in the school newspaper, a little mimeograph thing. And I'd be walking down the halls of my school, and sixth graders would say to me, "I liked your story." And I thought, "Wow, this is something that I could, get, you know, I should do because this is fun. I like this." And but the fun part, I think, my dad had that Louis Untermeyer book of American poetry, and I read it, and I loved T.S. Eliot. And for a long time, I was in T.S. Eliot land. I thought that he was the poet, and I loved four quartets, and so my poems were serious. But then I had two different mentors. One was Frank O'Hara, of course, and Walt Whitman. I mean, Walt Whitman, Allen Ginsberg. I started reading. I loved Bob Dylan as a teenager. I read Rimbaud, and just those wild kind of imaginative poems really spoke to me. And then my husband David Kirby is a funny, funny guy, a funny poet, and when we started our lives together, we really kind of infected each other with that kind of joy, and I think that we both feel that. I know what I was raised in a fundamentalist Christian household, and they always talked about praying without ceasing. And I could never really figure out what that was all about. But then when I really got into poetry, David would say the poetry store is always open. And I feel like it's kind of like the Christian thing of praying without ceasing, but it's poetry with us. Everything is poetry, which was really proved on this trip because we go to a fried chicken stand and my mother would turn up, and there, it's just poetry is everywhere. You can't shut it out once you let it into your life. It's there always, and you just have to learn to recognize it and maybe you can't figure out right away what to do with it, but I know that when something happens to me, I go, "Oh, that could be a poem," or "That's a poem." I don't even say that could be a poem. That is a poem. It's just up to me to figure out how to make it into that poem, or how to let it go through me and become a poem.
It sounds almost like it has a spiritual aspect.
I guess it does. Yeah,
Maybe
it's
unconventional.
yeah, but it's I think that I don't know. I was raised as a believer, and when I stopped believing, I still had that muscle of belief, and so you find something else to believe in. And poetry is a beautiful thing to believe in, or just to, let take hold of your life. It's, I'm always finding new poets, young poets, but then older poets too. I teach a class at Florida State University on the letters of the poets, which is, just divine. And more letters are being published all the time. And I start with Ovid and end with the Beats. So, but Sylvia Plath's letters have just been published too, which is really quite interesting.
Part of your appeal, at least to me, is that combination of sort of erudition and language lust with all sorts of dialects and syntax and slang and jargon. Does it ever kind of kidnap you? Do you ever have difficulty reining it in, or when you finish a draft, editing?
I don't know. It's I love words, and diction is my strong suit. I mean, but I've really cultivated it over the years. When I was in the fourth grade, I grew up in a working class family, and we didn't have very many books. We had the Bible, we had my dad's poetry book, but not much else. And they offered a really inexpensive dictionary. And I asked my mom, can I buy that? It was probably $4, but expensive for us. And she said yes, and I bought it. And I just remember having that little book and looking at it and thinking, oh my God, all of these words. Will I ever be able to learn all of them, and just being thrilled with it, and I never lost that thrill of just, wanting to, to the English. I tell my students, English is we have the largest vocabulary. I mean, we're omnivorous. We steal from everybody, and so just use it. We're all trying to tell our own stories. And I always think that my favorite poems are the ones in which I feel as though, like Frank O'Hara's Telephone, you pick it up and Shakespeare's telling you about this woman he loves, and she's crazy about her, she's beautiful and musical, and then his best friend steals her from him, but he loves him too, and what's he gonna do? And I mean, it's like picking up the phone and having somebody tell you for 400 years what's going on in their lives and what it is to be a human being in time.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's going on. But then for me, it's finding the words for it, the diction for it. I have a side obsession with words in other languages that can't be translated into one word in English, and I'm always trolling for those kinds of words, and trying to use them. And if I find I have a student who's a language major. I love Japanese especially. And Japanese, Russian, German is just the best. I was just talking to a friend about her daughter's in a kind of a language immersion school, and about and I asked her, find words for me, would you please? And she's 10, and she was like, she was saying, what do you mean? What kind of words? And I said, okay, there's a word I love. It's Scheissbedauern, which translates literally from German, shit regret. It's the regret that things aren't as bad as you hope they would be.
So German.
Well, I mean, everybody's felt that, haven't they? It's like in Weltschmerz, and we all know Schadenfreude, but Scheissbedauern. Oh, I love it.